So my article is based primarily on an interest in paradiplomacy, or the sub-state activities of, or the diplomatic activities of sub-state actors. So the article speaks primarily to that literature. It also speaks to foreign policy studies and in general. And one of the big questions in the literature is when sub-state actors engage in diplomatic activities that elicit criticism or hostility from the central government, because they're not all hostile. So typically the sub-state government would engage in contacts with foreign diplomats or representatives, and they are sometimes praised or sometimes criticized by the central government. So conflict dynamics are a really big question in this field. And typically when scholars try to answer this question, they'll look at variables inside the dyad, inside the sub-state unit, and inside the host government. And my article complicates this view because in the process of reading a lot of this literature, I realized that it is entirely possible that third parties are also significant in understanding the conflict dynamics. And in particular, sovereign states get involved in the relationship between sub-state governments and host states. So that was kind of my goal, is to incorporate another actor into understanding this this dynamic. And this was inspired also by the ethnic conflict and nationalism literature, because there we have a much more acute sense that ties between a particular ethnic group, sometimes within a subnational government, with the central government, tend to be informed by the presence of other third parties, particularly what are called kin states. So the most natural first step to trying to incorporate this triangular view in sub-state diplomacy conflict dynamics is to pick a very restricted universe of cases. What I did is I started looking at cases where we have a state, a sovereign state or a central government, and then a kin non-state government or non-central government that has connections with that kin state. As I'll mention a little earlier, the idea is then to broaden this to a lot of other cases, not only to kin states, but sovereign states in general. So I picked three cases as empirical illustrations of the major roles that kin states can play in the triangular relationship. Here we're talking primarily about roles that are already identified in the ethnic conflict and nationalism literature. So I'm not treading new ground here in the sense of identifying new roles, but I am using some of the findings that we have in the ethnic conflict literature and translating them into the sub-state diplomacy literature as well. So in all three of my cases, the sub-state unit is already engaged in a conflictual relationship with the host state. And here conflict is defined simply in terms of the central government criticizing the international forays of sub-state government elites. And in all three of these cases, we then have sub-state elites that reach out internationally. They try to project their voice abroad. And my question then is, how do the kin states react to these requests? Because typically sub-state governments target primarily their kin states. Those are kind of the most natural targets that they identify. The three case studies identify a range of roles that these states play. So first off, there is one kin state, Sweden, that plays more of a non-intervention role. In other words, they do not respond too much to the appeals of the sub-state unit. So I'm looking at the triangular relationship between Sweden, Finland, and the Åland Islands, primarily Swedish-speaking autonomous area in Finland. In this case, in the 1920s into the 1940s, so these are instances that are bound historically we have Åland Island officials that reach out to Sweden, potentially even for conversations about unification, but Sweden rejects these appeals and rejects claims that the identity of the locals there is extremely threatened. So in this case, this non-intervention role essentially involves minimizing the voice projection of the substate unit and working with the central government, primarily that is with Finland, to resolve whatever conflict is in existence there. A second role that I look at is focuses more on mediation. So I look at the relationship between Austria-Italy and South Tyrol in the 1950s and the 1960s. There, South Tyrol reaches out to Austria during this period. They project their international voice. This is, of course, criticized by Italian authorities because they do not have a right to project their voice internationally, according to Italian officials. And Austria, at first, accepts to amplify South Tyrol's voice. So this this creates a lot of conflict. However, this mediator role involves, at least when it comes to Austria's behavior, some degree of cooperation and conciliation with the central state. So in this instance, we have Austria that to some extent exacerbates the conflict between the substate unit and the central government, while at the same time seeking not to minimize the voice of the central government in the triangular relationship. In the long term, this tends to reduce conflict between these parties. And then finally, I look at Quebec in the 1960s and its relationship with France and Canada. This is one of the most well-known case studies of triangular relationships. And here the argument is quite simply that in the 1960s, France's role in the triangular relationship is to exacerbate conflict. So Quebec reaches out to France primarily to project its voice abroad independently of Ottawa. Ottawa criticizes these efforts, and France serves as a willing interlocutor. And in addition, tries to minimize Ottawa's voice, particularly when it comes to signing major agreements, direct visits and interactions with local elites, and so on. So these are the three broad findings that I have in this kind of narrow set of case studies. My next step is to then broaden this triangular conceptualization beyond the kin state, beyond the kin state example, and to really understand how sovereign states themselves get involved in ties with substate diplomacy. So within the field of paradiplomacy, this is really a fascinating topic to me. Why do sovereign states have direct connections with substate units, sometimes despite criticism by central governments in which those substate units are located, and what are the various types of interactions that these sovereign states support. Another step here, and I address this a little bit in the conclusion, is to investigate the motivations behind the various behaviors of the kin state. So I didn't have enough space in the journal, nor was this in the journal article, nor was this the main point of the article. The idea here was to show what happens when we move from a dyadic to a triangular approach. But a future project looks at both the domestic and the international determinants of a kin state's behavior in the triangular relationship. So, for example, the presence of someone like Charles de Gaulle was essential in France's promotion of direct ties with Quebec that were criticized by Ottawa. So that's the main kind of point that I make in the article. So I think there are a few cases, and some of these are bound by region. Probably the most likely area in which there might be some degree of conflict rather than cooperation is the post-Soviet region. In particular, Russia serves as a kin state to a significant volume of sub-state units, and in general, just a large Russian-speaking population in the region. So I think, given in light of Russia's projection of power in the near abroad, we are likely to see Russia promote direct ties, some of them criticized by the smaller central governments, with either autonomous regions or cities and any other non-central government. So, for example, if you look at the Gagauz case in the Republic of Moldova, Russia in that case plays a role that exacerbates conflict within the central government and the sub-state unit, the autonomous region. I would also pay attention to the Serbia, Republika Srpska, Bosnia-Herzegovina triangular relationship and the relationship between Hungary, Romania, and some of the Hungarian-speaking regions in Romania proper. Now, in the latter case, the Hungarian populated areas don't have as many foreign policy powers as do other entities, but I believe it still can generate some degree of tension in those triangular relations. I also want to make a broader point about the issue of conflict and cooperation. So there is this sense, and I see this in the literature, on both sub-state diplomacy and some ethnic conflict literature that says that more local autonomy or more local power for local governments is going to lead almost automatically, or at least it's much more likely to lead to peace. This may be true, but in what I've found in my own research is that the behavior and the motivation of kin states is going to be really essential in either stabilizing or destabilizing the relationship. So just as a broad point, I think it is important when we study conflict and cooperation between sub-state governments and central governments. We need to also understand both the short-term and the long-term potential of a stabilizing or destabilizing role that a kin state might play.